You built a swimming pool where? I asked, staring at the muddy disaster outside my window in disbelief. The foreman didn't even glance up. HOA blueprints, buddy. Says this land's common area. I looked down. My slippers were half sunk in the churned-up earth that, up until yesterday, was my orchard. The irony didn't escape me. I'd spent 5 years tending to that land, pruning peach trees, fixing the fencing by hand, and clearing out wild brush with sweat and patience. Now a concrete mixer was spinning at full speed, a boom crane was lifting steel beams over my barn roof, and a half-dressed construction crew was blaring pop music like they were laying the foundation for Disneyland. That would have been bad enough, if not for the HOA president herself, Karen, with her signature sun visor and clipboard, who waved at me like I was the guest here. "Good morning, sir. Please stay off the site for safety reasons," she called out. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. I stormed out past the fence line, if you could even call it that anymore, since the back third of it had been torn down to make room for the pool excavation. Karen was standing in a lawn chair like a dictator on parade, sipping cucumber water and instructing workers where to place the future cabana. She didn't even flinch as I approached, though the sight of me in a plaid robe and untied boots probably wasn't very intimidating. "Karen," I said calmly, though my voice was barely containing the rage beneath, "what in God's name are you doing building a pool on my property?" She looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Oh, don't be dramatic. This is community green space. Always has been. It's been maintained by the HOA since before you moved here, remember?" I blinked, speechless. "That's funny," I finally said, "because I paid the taxes on this green space every year since I bought it. And I've got the deed, survey, and boundary markers to prove it." Karen's smile faltered, just for a second, but then she tilted her head. "Well, if that's true, we'll sort it out with the board later. But for now, I'd appreciate it if you stayed clear. You're holding up construction." I looked past her at the mess, bulldozers, stacked rebar, tarps covering my now smashed raised beds. This wasn't an innocent mistake. This was hostile occupation in flip-flops and designer sunglasses. I stormed back into my house, mud trailing behind me like a breadcrumb trail of disbelief. My hands shook as I flipped through the thick binder I kept in the cabinet, original deed, plat map, topographic surveys. It was all there, clear as day. The HOA boundary ended 20 feet short of the pool's edge. They hadn't just crossed a line. They'd built a water park in my living room and had the nerve to tell me to enjoy the chlorine. By afternoon, I'd already called the county office. No permits had been filed for a pool of that size. Not by the HOA, not by Karen, not by the construction company. I called the HOA hotline and was greeted with an automated loop of "leave a message." I didn't bother. I already knew how that would end. So instead, I took out my phone and began filming. I filmed the broken fence, the tire tracks across my garden, the delivery trucks unloading pool tiles in my driveway. And I filmed Karen walking by, inspecting it all like some self-appointed queen overseeing her kingdom. When I asked her again, on camera, if she had any proof the HOA owned this land, she laughed and said, "Sweetheart, the HOA owns everything you can see. You just rent your little corner." That clip would go viral later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That night, I got a knock on the door. Karen again. This time with 2 HOA board members in tow. Ted, the guy who once tried to fine me for painting my shed barn red instead of HOA beige, and Lori, who treated every landscaping violation like it was a federal offense. They stood awkwardly while Karen handed me a sealed envelope and a smile. "Just a peace offering," she said. Inside was a check for $500 and a pre-written statement releasing the HOA of any responsibility in exchange for goodwill compensation. I nearly laughed. "You think this is over $500? I asked. "Karen, you've got 3 tons of concrete curing on my fruit trees." She looked at me and lowered her voice. "Don't escalate this. You'll just make it harder on yourself. Courts don't like land disputes. It's a waste of time and money. Just be a team player." The smugness in her tone burned deeper than any of the actual damage. I didn't say anything. I just closed the door and picked up the phone. My brother-in-law Mitch wasn't just family. He was the kind of real estate attorney that made HOA boards cry into their bylaws. When I told him what happened, he didn't even hesitate. "Text me photos. Every inch. Every invoice. Every interaction." Then he paused. "And get ready to own that pool." Before bed, I walked out to the edge of the property, where the pool outline had already been dug deep into the soil. I stood there, looking at the hole they carved into my life, and whispered, "They think I'm a pushover. Let's see how they like swimming in a lawsuit." It was no longer about a pool. It was about power, about land, about the HOA thinking they could bully the wrong guy just because he liked growing peaches and kept to himself. But they'd soon learn I wasn't just a quiet neighbor, I was the owner of this land. And they just built their dream pool in the middle of their biggest nightmare. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I had already sent over 20 photos to Mitch, close-ups of the fence line, GPS coordinates from my phone with the boundary markers, drone snapshots showing the concrete slab running directly through my orchard, and of course, the video of Karen proclaiming the HOA owned everything I could see. Mitch replied with just one word: "Jackpot." I didn't know exactly what that meant yet, but I trusted him. The man had once gotten a land developer to pay out a 6-figure settlement over a 10-foot sidewalk encroachment. If anyone could turn a backyard disaster into courtroom gold, it was him. Later that morning, while Karen and her pool builders were busy arguing over tile patterns and waterfall features, I launched the drone again. This time I flew higher, slowly mapping out every inch of the HOA's new construction. It was all there. A 70-foot pool, a raised deck, underground plumbing trenches, even a half-finished cabana structure that extended well past the oak tree I planted when I first moved in. When I reviewed the footage on my laptop, I noticed something odd. Several of the construction materials, cinder blocks, patio stones, even some of the filtration gear, had the logo of a company I recognized, Silverline Property Services. That caught my attention because I remembered seeing the same name on the back of a landscaping truck last year, the one Karen's nephew drove. I called Mitch and explained what I found. He told me to look into the company's ownership. 10 minutes of searching and a few cross-referenced LLC registrations later, it became crystal clear. Silverline was owned by Karen's cousin, and it had received over $300,000 in payments from the HOA over the past 18 months. I emailed Mitch the links. He responded with a longer message this time. "This isn't just trespassing anymore. This is fraud, conflict of interest, and misuse of association funds. You may be sitting on a multimillion-dollar case." That night, I started a file. I printed every piece of evidence I had, every receipt, HOA notice, survey map, screenshot, drone photo, and quote from Karen. I called the county clerk's office and requested copies of every permit and inspection the HOA had filed in the past 2 years. Most came back clean, except for one red flag. There was no permit issued for any pool construction on any parcel within the neighborhood. That meant the HOA had either faked documents to the contractors or never intended to follow the law at all. By the end of the week, I had everything ready. Mitch drove up to my property himself that Saturday, stepped out of his beat-up Ford pickup wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, and looked around like a surveyor preparing to level a battlefield. He spent the entire afternoon walking the land with me, measuring distances with his own laser scope, marking out boundary points with survey tape, and documenting where each portion of the pool and cabana had violated zoning limit. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "They didn't just cross into your land. They're 12 feet into it on one side, and the plumbing system cuts all the way under your barn foundation. That's structural trespass." We went back inside and sat down over coffee while Mitch began sketching out a legal plan. He explained that under state law, I could sue for compensation based on market land value, destruction of property, emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages if we proved intent. If the jury agreed that Karen had knowingly signed off on plans that crossed into my property, we could ask for up to $2 million. But we need more than just photos, he said. We need to prove they knew what they were doing, and that they tried to cover it up. That's when I remembered something. I pulled out an old HOA newsletter from 6 months back, the one where Karen wrote a column bragging about our community's exciting new recreation plan, along with an image of the proposed pool. At first glance, the design looked harmless, but once I held it up next to the plat map, I saw it. The pool outline in the newsletter extended right over my lot's border. Mitch examined it, shook his head, and smiled. That's intent. This shows they planned this exact layout long before ever asking permission. We spent the next 2 days compiling a legal brief so airtight it could have floated in the pool they built. Mitch drafted an official notice of intent to sue, addressed to the HOA board, and scheduled a private sit-down with the county zoning board. He told me we weren't going to fight this quietly, we were going to expose it publicly, cleanly, and with every ounce of legal power we had. The day of the zoning board meeting came fast. I wore my nicest shirt, clean boots, tucked in flannel, the one my wife used to say made me look like I owned the town. Mitch walked in ahead of me, carrying a thick binder and a flash drive. Karen was already seated in the room with 2 of her board members, whispering nervously as we entered. She wore a bright pink blazer and a forced smile, but her hands kept fidgeting with her phone. The meeting began, and Karen immediately tried to deflect attention. We're here today to request a retroactive permit for a community improvement project that will benefit all residents. She clicked through a presentation showing happy kids and pool chairs. But then Mitch stood up and calmly plugged in the flash drive. Within seconds, the projector showed aerial images of the property line violations, purchase orders made out to Karen's cousin's company, and the infamous video of her claiming the HOA owned everything you can see. The room fell silent. One board member from the county leaned in and said, "Ms. Karen, did you authorize construction on a parcel of land not owned by the HOA?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Mitch handed each official a printed binder with our evidence. The county chair took one look at the survey overlay and sighed. "This is bad. This isn't just a permitting issue. This is a property dispute with potential civil liability." Karen tried to regain her footing, claiming the land boundaries were confusing and that no harm was intended. Mitch countered with the deed, tax documents, and construction invoices, all time-stamped, all undeniable. The board tabled her permit request and adjourned the meeting with a statement that a formal investigation would begin immediately. As we left the building, Karen followed us to the parking lot. Her voice cracked as she called out, "We can still settle this, you know. No need to go to court." I turned and smiled, just slightly. "Oh, we're already in court. You just don't know it yet." That night, I stood out by the pool again, only now it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like the centerpiece of the biggest legal takedown this HOA had ever seen. The air was thick with summer heat, but for the first time in days I felt cool. Because the more they built, the deeper they dug their own hole. And soon, they'd realize they didn't just trespass on my land, they handed me the ammunition to bury them in it. The fallout from the zoning board meeting didn't take long to begin. By the following morning, I noticed the mood around the construction site had shifted. The workers, once loud and laid back, were now stiff, quiet, and visibly uneasy. They no longer waved when I walked past. Some wouldn't even make eye contact. One guy actually packed up his gear and left midday, muttering something about not getting dragged into a lawsuit. I didn't blame him. Word spreads fast in small communities, and once the county announced their formal investigation, the HOA's pet project started looking less like a pool and more like a crime scene. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down on her delusion. She began walking the neighborhood with a clipboard, trying to spin the story in her favor. I overheard her on more than one occasion telling residents that the dispute was just a technicality, that I was being unreasonable, and that it would all be resolved quietly. She even claimed I had donated the land verbally years ago during a neighborhood picnic. That would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. I hadn't even lived here that long. Karen was rewriting history like it was a fairy tale, and she thought everyone was too blind to check the fact. But the HOA wasn't just spinning stories, they started fighting dirty. It began with little things. Someone threw a bag of mulch across my front porch one night. My mailbox got knocked off its post, not once but 3 times in a week. I reported it, of course, but the sheriff could only do so much without hard proof. So I installed new motion lights and cameras, high resolution with night vision and cloud backup. A few days later, the cameras caught what I expected. A figure in a hoodie and flip-flops dragging a trash bag full of construction debris and dumping it right behind my barn. I sent the footage to Mitch, who forwarded it to the sheriff's office. That was the first official warning issued to the HOA. Then came the anonymous complaint. Every other day I get a citation taped to my door, claims that my grass was too tall, that my barn was an unregistered accessory structure, that my chickens were causing a noise disturbance. One complaint even alleged that I was illegally running a business out of my garage, because I had a woodworking bench and some tools. Each one was filed through the HOA's internal system and conveniently signed only as concerned resident. But I knew exactly who was behind them. Karen was weaponizing the very system she'd spent years lording over the community with, now twisting it into her own personal vendetta engine. Despite all that, I stayed calm. Mitch's advice was clear. Document everything, respond to nothing without legal review, and don't retaliate. Let them show their true colors. Let the evidence pile up until it buried them on its own. That restraint paid off more than I could have imagined. One afternoon, while reviewing camera footage, I spotted something strange. A construction crew was operating well into the evening, well past the county's work hour limits. But that wasn't the weird part. One of the trucks parked across my driveway wasn't from Silverline, it was from a rental company, and the license plate matched a vehicle registered in a completely different district. I walked outside, approached one of the workers, and casually asked who ordered the late-night pour. He looked confused. "Didn't Karen say you approved this?" I asked him to clarify. Apparently, Karen had told the contractors I was now cooperating, and that any last-minute changes should be directed to her. I smiled, thanked him for the info, and went back inside to call Mitch. This was more than trespassing now. This was impersonation. Karen was speaking on my behalf to contractors, using her position to manipulate third parties, and it was all without a shred of legal right. Mitch told me it was time to turn up the pressure. That night, he filed a cease and desist against the HOA, citing ongoing harassment, property damage, impersonation, and fraudulent use of my name in construction communications. It was the first legal volley in what was about to become a full-on war. As if sensing that their empire was beginning to crumble, the HOA scheduled an emergency board meeting. I heard about it through the grapevine, closed door, board members only, not open to residents. That didn't sit right with me. Fortunately, not everyone on the board was loyal to Karen. One of the newer members, a woman named Sandra, quietly called me and asked if I knew what was going on. When I told her the full story, she was horrified. She confessed she'd had her doubts about Karen's leadership for months but hadn't spoken out, afraid of being bullied off the board. I asked her a simple favor: attend the meeting, keep quiet, and just record everything. What she brought me the next day blew the doors off the whole case. The recording captured Karen instructing the board to fast-track a motion to designate my parcel as temporary community recreation space, citing a made-up emergency clause. She justified it by claiming the pool project was too far along to reverse. One board member hesitated, asking about legal risk. Karen snapped, "It's easier to apologize in court than stop progress now. He won't push this all the way." That line became our slogan. Mitch laughed when he heard it and said, "They just handed us their own noose." I released a statement the next morning, complete with audio clips, to the neighborhood Facebook group. I didn't call Karen out directly, but I laid out every timeline, document, permit failure, and violation. I made it crystal clear that this wasn't just a land disagreement, it was a premeditated abuse of power. Within hours, the post had over 200 comments, half a dozen shares, and several HOA residents demanding an emergency vote to suspend Karen pending the investigation. The tide had shifted. Karen showed up at my gate that evening, red-faced and furious. She yelled at me from the sidewalk, demanding I take down the lies. I didn't say a word. I just pointed up to the camera above my porch, then slowly raised my phone and started recording. She froze, then stormed off, muttering threats under her breath. That video, too, found its way online. And just like that, the woman who once ruled the HOA like a monarch now looked like a dictator in denial, caught in her own flood of lies. But the storm wasn't over. Not yet. Because while Karen tried to save face in public, behind the scenes she was quietly meeting with lawyers, calling in favors, and trying to find a way to spin the narrative back in her favor. What she didn't know was that Mitch and I had already filed the formal civil suit. And the paperwork sitting on her desk, buried under a pile of HOA newsletters and half-signed pool contracts, would be the document that changed everything. Because once she opened it, she'd realize this wasn't just about a pool anymore. This was about ownership, justice, and a $2 million reckoning headed straight for her doorstep. The court summons hit harder than any HOA violation notice Karen had ever handed out, and this time, she couldn't just shrug it off with a fake smile and a clipboard. Mitch made sure the lawsuit was filed with precision: trespassing, structural encroachment, willful property damage, fraudulent misrepresentation, misuse of HOA funds, and defamation. It was a full legal orchestra, and every note was backed by evidence. The official amount sought was just over $2 million, including damages, land value, legal fees, emotional distress, and punitive costs. It was a number that turned heads, and judging by the HOA meeting minutes that started leaking from the inside, it also turned Karen's stomach. Suddenly, she wasn't walking the neighborhood like a queen anymore. She was ducking behind hedges and pretending to take phone calls when neighbors passed. Our court date was set 3 weeks out. That gave the HOA just enough time to panic, hire a lawyer of their own, and try to play damage control. Their strategy? Deny everything, claim the land boundaries were ambiguous, and argue that the construction had been done in good faith. Mitch laughed when he read their initial response. Good faith doesn't pour 20 yards of concrete through someone's apple grove, he said. And he was right. Because in court, intentions matter, but not as much as evidence. And we had mountains of it. The morning of the hearing, I showed up early in my best clothes. Not to impress anyone, but because I wanted to walk into that courtroom feeling like the man who owned the land everyone was arguing about. Mitch arrived right after me, dressed sharp but calm, carrying 2 briefcases full of exhibits, sworn affidavits, and chronological timelines. On the other side of the courtroom, Karen sat rigid next to her lawyer, who looked less like a legal powerhouse and more like someone reluctantly defending a bad Yelp review. A few HOA board members sat behind her, avoiding eye contact with everyone. When the judge entered, everyone rose. He was a tall, no-nonsense man in his 60s with a reputation for hating property line disputes, unless, as he once famously said, someone pours a damn pool on the wrong side. I felt the corner of Mitch's mouth twitch when the judge looked over the case folder and raised his eyebrows slightly. That moment told me everything was going to change. Karen's lawyer went first, spinning the same tired lines. Confusion over boundaries, verbal permission, minor oversight. But when Mitch took the floor, it was like watching a movie. He began with a blown-up satellite image projected onto the courtroom screen, clearly showing the encroachment. Then he layered on the drone footage, the survey documents, the city plat maps, and side-by-side comparisons of the HOA's own pool renderings with the actual location. He followed it with the shell company invoices tied to Karen's cousin and the newsletter she authored describing the planned build months before any discussion ever took place. The real blow, though, came when Mitch played the secret recording from the HOA's closed-door meeting, the one where Karen admitted they were too far along to stop and suggested it was better to apologize later than delay progress. The room went dead silent. Karen's face drained of color. Her lawyer fumbled with papers, trying to object, but the judge waved it off. "You don't need to be a land surveyor to see what's happening here," the judge muttered, leaning back in his chair. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't give a long speech. I told the truth. I spoke about the years I'd spent improving that land, the way I'd nurtured it tree by tree, the peace I had found there after retiring from firefighting. I explained how it felt to wake up and see bulldozers tearing through it without a single conversation, without permission, without remorse. I told them about the harassment, the threats, the lies, and the way my own property had been turned into a construction site for other people's convenience. And then I finished with just one sentence. If it can happen to me, it can happen to any neighbor who doesn't bow down to a clipboard and a sun visor. The judge didn't need long. After a short recess, he returned with a decision that felt like a thunderclap. The HOA was found liable on every count. They were ordered to pay $2 million in total damages, demolish any construction on my land within 60 days, and submit to a full independent audit of their finances. The court also issued a temporary injunction preventing Karen from holding any position in the HOA until the investigation into financial misconduct concluded. Karen didn't faint, but she might as well have. She sat frozen as the judge read out the ruling, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe her name was the one being dragged through legal cement instead of the pool she'd poured. Her lawyer just stared straight ahead, already defeated. A few of the board members behind her stood up quietly and walked out before the session even ended. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Some were neighbors, others were local reporters who'd caught wind of the case after I posted the Facebook update a few days before. When I stepped down the stairs, someone clapped. Then another. It wasn't a parade, but it wasn't silence either. I didn't say much to the press, just that I hoped the ruling would remind everyone that property laws exist for a reason and that community doesn't mean letting people trample over you, literally or legally. Later that evening, I returned home. The construction site was still there, silent now, with the work halted and the tarps fluttering in the wind. I walked out to the edge of the pool, stood at the deep end where my favorite cherry tree used to be, and took a deep breath. It wasn't just about winning a case. It was about restoring something they tried to steal, not just land, but dignity, respect, the right to say, "This is mine," and not have someone rip it out from under you while smiling. Mitch called that night, voice relaxed for the first time in weeks. "You know," he said, "they could have just asked you to partner on the project, maybe even lease the land. You might have said yes." I laughed. "Yeah, and they might have found gold buried under it too. But they wanted it all for free. And now they're paying the full price." He paused for a moment. "This will probably set precedent. HOAs around the county are watching. You just made case law." I smiled at the thought. Not bad for a retired guy who just wanted to grow fruit and be left alone. But now, instead of peaches, I was harvesting accountability. And that, I had to admit, was a pretty sweet crop. 2 weeks after the court ruling, the first demolition crew rolled onto the property. There was no fanfare, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just the high-pitched grind of a backhoe's engine and the echoing slam of metal on concrete. I stood at the edge of my property with a coffee in hand, watching as the very pool Karen had bragged about to every resident got ripped up, chunk by chunk. They started with the cabana structure. It had barely been finished, still covered in bright blue tarp, but the moment the crew knocked down the first wooden beam, it felt like poetic justice. The second Karen's dream pool began turning back into rubble, neighbors started showing up. Some came with cameras, some brought folding chairs, and a few just stood there silently, arms crossed, watching what had become the neighborhood's most expensive mistake being undone. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be seen. After the verdict, she'd gone completely silent. Word had it she'd resigned from the HOA under pressure, but the resignation wasn't her idea. It came after several residents demanded her immediate removal during a chaotic emergency meeting held in the community center. A few longtime board members tried to protect her, but after the audio recording of her saying it was easier to apologize in court than stop progress was played for the entire room, the mood flipped. By the end of the night, not only had she stepped down, but the HOA voted to suspend all large-scale construction projects until a full audit of their finances was complete. The audit, by the way, was already turning up problems: missing invoices, fake expense entries, and shady contracts with companies all tied to Karen's relative. What started as a pool project had become a full-scale corruption scandal. I didn't gloat. There was no victory dance, no social media celebration. I'd already had my moment in court, and that was enough. What mattered more was restoring what had been taken. After the demolition crew cleared the debris and filled the excavation site with fresh soil, I brought out a bag of seeds, native wildflowers, the kind that bloom in waves of color across the property. I scattered them across the bare earth where the deep end used to be. It wasn't about revenge. It was about returning the land to something natural, something mine. Over the following weeks, something unexpected began to happen. Neighbors who had never said more than a casual hello started dropping by. Some brought over pie, some brought fence repair tools, and one even dropped off a young cherry sapling as a sort of peace offering. They all said the same thing in different ways: that they didn't realize how far the HOA had gone, how unchecked Karen's control had become. Apparently, many of them had been afraid to speak up for years. She ran things with an iron fist disguised as HOA regulations and passive-aggressive newsletters. My lawsuit had cracked that illusion wide open, and people were finally ready to rebuild the community in a way that wasn't driven by fear of fines or who had the shiniest mailbox. One neighbor in particular, Sandra, the board member who had secretly helped me record that closed-door meeting, ended up running for HOA president. She won in a landslide, not because she promised to punish anyone, but because she promised transparency. Her first act in office was to abolish the anonymous complaint system. Her second act was to hold open forums monthly so residents could speak freely. And the third? She drafted a formal apology from the HOA to me, one that the board unanimously approved and mailed to every resident along with a statement of new bylaws ensuring no HOA project would ever proceed without unanimous approval for land usage. I hung that letter in my barn, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that community doesn't mean control. It means respect. It means conversations, not bulldozers. With the settlement money, I had options. I could have moved, bought land somewhere more remote, away from HOAs and concrete nightmares. But I stayed, because I'd already planted too many roots here, literally and figuratively. Instead of running, I reinvested. I hired a local contractor to renovate the barn into a multi-use workshop space. I put in new insulation, solar panels, and wide benches made from reclaimed oak. Then I started something new, a woodworking program for veterans and local teens. Every Saturday, we'd gather in that barn and make things from scratch. Chairs, birdhouses, shelves, even a canoe once. Some came to learn, others just needed a place to breathe. Either way, the space became something Karen's pool never could be, a source of real connection. Every now and then, I'd get visitors. Reporters curious about the case, lawyers asking if they could use my documents in similar lawsuits, even residents from other HOA communities looking for advice. I always told them the same thing: stand your ground, know your rights, and never underestimate how far some people will go when they think you won't fight back. Then I'd smile and point to the fence line, where a fresh wooden sign hung with hand-carved letters: private property. Respect required. On one bright Saturday morning, as wildflowers swayed where the deep end used to be and sawdust floated inside the barn, I looked around and realized something important. They didn't just try to steal my land. They tried to erase me from it. But in fighting back, I didn't just reclaim it, I transformed it. The destruction made space for something better. Something lasting. And as the final reminder of Karen's reign, the last piece of broken tile unearthed from the soil was tossed into the trash heap, I couldn't help but chuckle. All that time, all that money, all that scheming, just to build a pool that never held a single drop of water. But me? I built something solid, something real, and it was here to stay. Let them come see for themselves. Let them bring their clipboards, because now this land had a story, and every blade of grass knew exactly who it belonged to.